Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast would like to welcome Mr. Ben McCarey, head of Frensham Heights School, Surrey. Frensham Heights is a co-educational day and boarding school for pupils aged 3 to 18, which aims to offer a unique and transformational education. With a focus on students' individuality, happiness and potential, the school adopts a more informal setting with smaller class sizes to ensure that all pupils feel supported by their teachers and peers, placing emphasis not only on exam results, but also on fostering students' creativity, problem-solving and resilience that prepares them for life beyond the school. Ben joined Frensham Heights in 2024 and has previously worked at both state and independent schools across the country. It's a pleasure to have you on our Education Corner podcast. Can you tell us about your background and how you came to be head at Frensham Heights?
Yeah, of course. I guess my background is that I'm completely institutionalized by education. So I'm a third generation teacher. My grandfather was a teacher. My mother was a teacher. I went to boarding school from the age of 7 to 18. And even when I went home from school, I went home to a boarding house because my mum ran a boarding house. So my entire formative years were spent in and around education. I think that meant by the time I graduated, there was absolutely no way I was ever going to be a teacher. And I then kind of fell into education, I suppose, because I'd graduated from university, moved back in with my mum. I was working in a restaurant in Bath, having a lovely time. And after about 6 months of that, my mum turned around and said, "You've wasted all of that investment I put into your education. What are you doing with your degree?" And I lied and said that I'd already applied for teacher training. So I then had to put my money where my mouth was and apply for teacher training. And 20 years later, here I am as institutionalized as I ever was. So I spent 6 years in Bicester and a comprehensive in North Oxfordshire. I then went and did a stint in Brixton in South London in one of the most deprived wards in the country in a state academy there. And from there, I moved to my last job before Frensham, which was at Holyport College, which is a state boarding school near Maidenhead, partnered with Eton College. And I started there the year the school opened. So I did a startup, a full 10 years of growth, and built, I think, a really wonderful school. And I kind of thought I'd be there forever. And then Frensham appeared on the horizon, and from afar, I kind of fell in love with it and started to see it as where I wanted to be and where I wanted my kids to be. And here I am.
Could you tell us about the ethos and values, particularly now you've taken over? Obviously, you're going to bring your own room at Frensham Heights.
Yeah, I hope I bring my own spin, but actually I honestly see my job as getting back to the core values on which Frensham was built. So everybody at Frensham talks about the ethos and about the values and how important they are and the informality. You've got the visual markers that you see when you walk around the school, the absence of uniform, the informality between students and staff, the fact that I'm no longer Sir or Mr. McCarey, that's been retired. The kids call me Ben, and there's something really normalizing about that. But those for me are the outward markers. The core values are a belief in the goodness of humanity, the benevolence of the human spirit, and actually the belief that that doesn't just apply to us as adults, that that applies to kids too. They're great people. And in a world where too often the education system serves to beat that down, to put kids into boxes, to say to them, actually, the most important thing is that you comply with this long and very detailed set of rules so that you can learn to be a compliant human being. At Frensham, we really, really don't do that. We want them to have the freedom to express themselves, to make choices for themselves, to be themselves, to make mistakes, but then to pick them up when they fall, to help them to learn from those mistakes so that the human beings they become are so much more than the sum total of the grades they achieve. And actually, we find by doing it that way, the grades they achieve are pretty good too. So it kind of works both ways.
Very much so. While Frensham is a selective school, your website says you look beyond test results in the admissions process and make offers based on who we believe will thrive and benefit from our broad curriculum. Obviously, that's very different to, for example, the London schools, which are very test orientated. Could you explain more about the admissions process and what you look for in prospective students?
I struggle a bit actually with the description of us as a selective school. We're a school which selects on the basis, academically purely, this is at this point in time, that yes, you have to be able to access our curriculum and you have to be able to do so without your presence in the classroom being at the detriment of the energy the teacher can put into challenging the most able kids. I see us as an all-ability school, but that doesn't mean we're not an academic school. I don't really like the data conversation, but more than half of our GCSE grades last year were grades 7, 8 and 9. Half of our A-level grades were A and A star. So as an all-ability school, we are achieving really great things with a broader spectrum of kids than you might see in a selective school. But yeah, our admissions process is designed to allow kids the opportunity to show themselves and be themselves. We use the usual range of markers for their academic ability to make sure they can access the curriculum. And then we bring them into school and we give them a really broad range of activities and experiences within school. They might go swinging through the trees on our high ropes course. They might head down to the theatre and do an hour on stage makeup. You might see them dancing in the studio. You might see them doing some creative writing or various practical interactive tasks where we pull kids together, see how they interact with one another, and make sure that they can benefit from that experience, that informality. Obviously, the way we operate isn't for every child, and certainly there are some parents who are very uncomfortable when they first see it. But actually, if we're going to be informal, if we're not going to be rule-bound, we don't have detentions, we don't give kids negative points for forgetting their ballpoint pen or whatever it might be, we need kids who can rise to that standard. They don't all have to be able to get it all right exactly all of the time when they start, but the bar for the human beings we want and the way they interact with one another is high on a social basis. It doesn't mean they all have to be super confident either, because we believe really strongly that the way we operate can bring confidence out of kids, but we want to know that they can interact positively with their peers, they can benefit, and they can find enjoyment in the kind of experiences that kids have here.
It sounds quite inspiring, and it obviously works. In a way, I suppose you've covered some of this, but why do you think pupils from Frensham Heights are experiencing a different education to perhaps a more traditional boarding school?
There's so many ways. As somebody who was born and raised in boarding, and I know boarding's moved on since the 90s when I was living in it, but the reality is you're, in inverted commas, traditional boarding school. The boarder is still a child. The adults around them are naturally authoritarian, sir, miss, madam, whatever you want to call them. And even in a more homely environment, you will still have those barriers. For our boarders, they don't have that. Any boarding house wants to be home from home, I accept that, and it's achieved really well in a broad range of schools. But here, where the kids have genuine agency freedom, where we're not controlling the things they wear, the things they do, the choices they make within reasonable, safe boundaries, where our boarders are free to go off and walk in the woods, to cycle around the site, to enjoy time with their friends, and then return to staff who they're on first name terms with, who they have the closeness of relationship with. I do think it's a point of difference. We also try not to over-regiment their lives. It's really important that boarders are kept busy and they've got a really broad range of activities on offer, and with our on-site facilities, that's relatively easy to achieve. We don't have Saturday morning school, and we don't have compulsory sport on Saturday mornings. So weekends for the boarders who are here at weekends really are about relaxation, enjoyment, enrichment, and we offer a huge variety of that. But also our weekly boarders. It's an opportunity for many of them to escape from London. We run a bus out of Waterloo on a Sunday evening, which goes back on a Friday for our weekly London boarders. And when you escape the city for the panorama that we have here, with huge open skies and views out over the South Downs, it's a really beautiful and inspiring environment. And we think it gives kids freedom to be kids. They kind of stay young, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. You aim to have a more personal, informal relationship between teachers and pupils. What does this look like, and how do you feel that there are benefits? Because obviously there has to be mutual respect.
Obviously, there has to be mutual respect. But in my experience in education, and I've worked in some of the toughest schools in the country, right? Not just in cosy rural Surrey. And in any school environment that I've worked in, where you treat a teenager in particular with kindness, compassion, humanity, they tend to respond with respect. So often in schools, the conflict that arises between teachers and students is driven by the fact that there is an expectation of respect from a teenager towards an adult, but that actually the rules, regulations, and requirements put on that relationship tend to undermine that respect. If you think about a average 15-year-old walking into school in the morning, their shirts come untucked as they got off the school bus and walking into school, and their first interaction with an adult that day is, tuck your shirt in, or even please could you tuck your shirt in. With most teenagers' natural reaction, they're hyperactive amygdala, the fight or flight, there's always going to be an eye roll, even if it's an internal eye roll. Even if they smile and nod and say, oh yes, thank you so much for pointing it out, there's going to be a little subtle reaction in their brain of slight annoyance. And for lots of kids, this gets amplified throughout the day, where, I don't know, a child whose shirt is clearly far too small and comes untucked constantly. So they're having 15 interactions by 9:30 in the morning with different adults telling them to tuck their shirt in. It breeds attrition. I use the shirt as an example. It's not just about the uniform. But I think by removing those barriers and by saying to the teachers, actually, you don't have iron discipline at your disposal. There isn't going to be a detention here or a magic point where you can push a button on the computer and that's resolved the issue with the child. If you've got a challenge in your classroom or a challenge in a relationship, your job is to do what we do as parents, actually, and to do what we do in the workplace, which is work with that human being to work through the problem and to find a solution that you can pull together. And it works. I think people are scared of it. I think people looking in from outside might feel that somehow it's Lord of the Flies here. It's really, really not. It's full of happy, well-adjusted, well-behaved children who are nearly always, as much as one can say with teenagers, really respectful and really kind to the staff around them and to their peers. But it's achieved by helping them along the way rather than by giving them a set of boundaries and making them live in fear of those boundaries.
School's website says teachers are supported to be brave and innovative with their teaching, often mentioning experimental learning. I'm sure you've got quite a lot to tell me about this. How does it manifest and what impact do you find it is having on the pupils?
This is an interesting one as well. It's a conversation I have with parents quite a lot because I think the teachers do some phenomenal things, whether it's taking kids out into the woods, getting their hands dirty, whether it's blowing stuff up. I was hearing yesterday from one of our kids about something they did, and I think it was in a physics practical where they were flinging pumpkins for Halloween. It's giving teachers the license to experiment and to take risks. Because if we want our kids to be risk takers, our teachers have to be willing to take risks as well and know that sometimes when it doesn't quite work out, we're going to be there to pick them up when they fall. It's a balance to be struck because we also offer the full range and a very broad range of qualifications that you'd expect to find in any school. We're not a school that's thrown out the GCSEs or the A-levels. We have a very broad range of GCSEs, A-levels and BTECs. And we do also need to make sure that kids do well in those. So it's about striking balance. And it's also about how you enrich the curriculum beyond the classroom, because there are times when in maths, you really need to solve simultaneous equations. And whilst you might write that on a wall or you might write it on the desk with shaving foam or whatever else it is, you've still got to learn to solve simultaneous equations. And so we also make sure that there are a huge range of opportunities, both enriching the existing curriculum and around the curriculum to give kids that breadth. So, for example, in year 7 every year, we have our flood project where over the period of a week, we simulate rising ocean levels and the kids have to adapt and plan their food supplies, their new politics and how they're going to manage the situation. In year 8, they have the village project where they go and live wild in the woods for 4 days and they build their own society and they make their own bowls and spoons out of wood and they cook their own food. And also, and this is the part that's most scary from a staff point of view, for some of the time, if they're in the woods for 3 days solid, there might be a 4-hour period in the middle of the day where we don't tell them what to do and say, you guys work it out. And it's amazing what they then come up with. They build their own football pitches or they start creating new games that they've not played before and kind of building their own structures, because you leave a bunch of year 8s in the woods for 3 or 4 days without their mobile phones and without any form of entertainment. And they revert back to kind of those human interactions, the way that we might have kept ourselves entertained in the past. And so it's about risk-taking the classroom and making sure that the learning experiences are really fun, really innovative, really engaging, building in risk, but also then providing those opportunities where we're saying this week it's not about the curriculum at all. And it's not about your exam results at all. It's about developing you as a human being in a way that is unique and special and interesting and will give you an experience that you can remember for your lifetime.
Well, I'm going to have to come and join in one of the camps. How do you balance academic success? Because obviously, there is a factor where we all need certain grades, as a passport, with pupil well-being and preparing them for life beyond school.
I have a theory on academic success. Because, I talk to lots of parents who are looking at, for example, highly selective schools. And the reason they're looking at highly selective schools is because they want to make sure that their son or daughter gets the best possible set of grades. And the amount of times I say to a parent, look, I'm going to tell you a secret. And that is that there are lots of kids who are really bright, who go to schools that are not selective, and they also get really, really good grades. The school I worked at in Brixton is probably not a school where lots of your parents would want to send their kids. But my top set, year 11, the last year I was there, every single one of them got an A star in English language, an A star in English literature. And that wasn't just because I'm a wonderful teacher, I like to hope that I am, but that's because those were really bright kids, maybe from disadvantaged backgrounds, who worked really hard, who had great values, and they left with exactly the same grades that they would have got if they'd gone to a really highly selective London independent school. As I said, more than 50% of our GCSE grades were graded 7, 8 and 9 last year. Now with that, we also have some kids who got lower grades than that, but did really, really well at their own level. And being educated with those kids in a more holistic, maybe more gentle, maybe more student-focused, humanistic way, didn't stop those bright kids getting the top grades. They got them anyway. But they got them on a different path, which allowed them to develop a greater level of empathy, a sense of common humanity, to be around a much more diverse range of human beings, which is what's going to happen when they go into the workplace. And they also learned them in an environment where they learned to interact on an even keel with the adults around them, where they're not deferential or they're not feeling that respect is something that's forced on them. And for me, when they've got both the grades that they would have got in a more selective school, but also a completely different and broader range of experiences, both socially and practically along the way, well, that for me is the true value of education. It's got to go beyond the grades.
That's one of the things we're very much thinking about in this edition is life skills. Next year, Frensham Heights will be celebrating its centenary. Obviously, there must be archives. In what ways do you feel the school has changed or remained the same, indeed, over the last 100 years?
I like to hope at its heart the core ethos has remained the same. We were founded 100 years ago. We were founded by 3 women in 1925, and there's not many schools in that era that were being founded by women. We were founded on the basis of a belief in the generosity of the human spirit. We were founded to be non-denominational. We were founded to be non-traditional and to provide an alternative to the more rigid structures of the education system at the time. And I feel like 100 years later, we're still doing that. There are some ways in which we've become more progressive. You know, the school did have a uniform when it was founded, and it did focus more on those traditional things. We had compulsory cross-country running. The school's been through a number of iterations. If you study the history of your school, you'll see that there are periods in the 1970s when certainly the school did become, I'm really trying not to use the word feral, but let's say really quite libertarian and quite relaxed. I believe we were the last school in the country to have a smoking shelter. And so what I see my job as being is balancing that beautiful philosophy that sits at the heart, where we want kids to have freedom, but we want to balance that against structure, where we want kids to have agency, but we want to balance that against a sense of social responsibility and doing good for the community. I hope the school has always evolved. I think the DNA remains the same, but kids change. And one of the conversations I have most, particularly with teachers who've been in the profession for longer, is, well, these kids aren't like the kids 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And they're not. And our job as adults as a school is to get on board with that, to understand them, to understand where we need to meet them on their ground. And that's a lot easier, by the way, when you don't have a uniform and you're not asking them to make, for example, binary decisions around what they wear, but also to understand where we need to stand our ground, where we need to say, for example, actually, we want you to be free, but we don't want you to be free to spend your entire day staring at your mobile phone. So you're not going to have that with you. Freedom comes with responsibility, and our responsibility as adults is to put those guidelines and those guardrails in so that they can exist with freedom within it. And I suppose my job is to provide that balancing act, is to know where the guardrails are. But again, it's what we do with our own children as parents. We impute our values to them, and that's what a successful school will do.
And obviously, you were explaining that you started in April, but it's very much your first year in this role. What vision do you have for the future for the school?
I think this school has never been more relevant in modern society. Part of the reason I left the state sector was because I felt it was becoming more rigid, more politically driven. Kids were being more and more quantified by the value of their outcomes. And that's not true for every state school. I know I'm generalizing. It was my experience as a state school head teacher. I believe that this school which really values and trusts their humanity and champions their individuality, frankly, should be better known. I'm surprised more people haven't heard of us. I'm surprised more schools aren't doing it the way we're doing it. And so I think I want to grow our reputation at the forefront of progressive education. I'm going to open on site here a Centre for Innovation and Research, particularly thinking about pedagogy and teaching practice. We talked about what experimental teaching looks like, and I want to now base that in research so that we're able to say much more cleanly, this is what we're aiming for. These are the techniques and the things that we know work, both because they inspire kids, but also because they help them to make progress towards where we want them to be. Founding that in research and action research with a dedicated centre here at the school, I think will really help to ground us and allow us actually to take more risks and to be bolder in how we operate. I want to also just get back to the things that have made Frensham really special. We've always been really big on outdoor education, on music, on the creative arts and the performing arts. I want to double down on those things, but I don't want to lose the balance that we have. Because even though we have that reputation, the reality is also that our most common university courses in the past 5 years are PPE, economics, and history. They're not necessarily just performing creative arts. And I love the fact that we can achieve that. Our most popular A level, it would be no surprise to anybody, is maths, with more than 60% of our grades at NA star. And I want to maintain that balance whilst growing the heart of Frensham that is this special, warm community and breadth of opportunity.
That sounds very exciting, and I've got to come back down and see you in situ. And thank you very much for joining us on our podcast. And I'm sure many parents will be very interested to hear your voice on all that's happening at Frensham Heights.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Chloe. Thank you for having me.